Turns out, community-led action on weather extremes. When the heat dome hit, nobody called the government first. They called their neighbor. They knocked on the door of the elderly woman down the street who they'd never actually spoken to before. They checked on the guy with asthma 3 houses over. And it worked. People survived who might not have. But here's what's disturbing. We built this entire system assuming professionals would handle it. We were wrong. So if communities are actually saving lives during climate disasters, why aren't we funding them like we mean it? Right now, weather is getting weirder and more dangerous. Heat waves kill silently. Cold snaps trap people in homes without heat. Floods destroy everything in hours. And for decades, we've had a plan. Government disaster response, professional emergency services, top-down coordination. It sounds logical, except it doesn't work equally for everyone. Poor neighborhoods get less warning. Elderly people living alone get forgotten. Disabled folks can't evacuate easily. Marginalized communities, the ones already dealing with crumbling infrastructure, get hit hardest and helped least. So researchers across the UK started asking a radical question. What if we stopped waiting for authorities and actually studied what communities are already doing to survive these events? A team of researchers from 5 British universities spent years investigating this. Lead researchers included L. Towers from Teesside University, A. Cronin de Chavez from Exeter, and contributors from Bristol and Lancaster. They published their findings in June 2026 in the journal Health Place. What they discovered was uncomfortable and important, and it changes how we should think about climate survival completely. Here's what they actually did. They didn't run a laboratory experiment. They went into real communities across the UK facing real weather emergencies. They interviewed people actively organising response efforts, community leaders, volunteers, local group coordinators. They looked at heatwaves, cold snaps and flooding events. They asked, what works? What gets in the way? What do communities need to keep doing this? Think of it like studying an actual emergency room instead of reading a textbook about emergency rooms. You see what actually happens, not what should happen on paper. What they found was striking. Communities are genuinely effective at protecting their members during extreme weather. When neighbours check on neighbours, mortality rates drop. When local groups coordinate shelter and warmth during cold snaps, vulnerable people survive. When communities pre-position sandbags and no evacuation routes, flooding causes less injury and death. This isn't hypothetical. This is documented, measurable health improvement happening right now in neighbourhoods across the country. The scale matters here. In some cases, community-led response prevented serious illness or death in 30 to 40% of at-risk people who otherwise would have had no support whatsoever. That's not a marginal improvement. That's the difference between people living and people dying. But, and this is the crucial part, the research also exposed something darker. Communities doing this work are exhausted, stretched, underfunded, relying on volunteer labour that has limits. They're operating without proper training in some cases, without liability protection, without coordination with official response systems, which sometimes creates chaos instead of helping. The people running these efforts are burning out. And in many cases, the same communities bearing the heaviest burden from climate disasters are the ones expected to volunteer their time and energy to solve it. That's not just inefficient, that's unjust. The researchers also found that effective community response depends heavily on trust. When people know and trust their neighbours, action happens faster. When there's a history of top-down government neglect, people don't believe official warnings, so they rely on community networks instead. But you can't manufacture trust overnight. It takes time and genuine investment in relationships. In communities where historical inequalities have eroded trust, building this takes years, and climate disasters don't wait for years. They happen in hours. Another finding, what works in one community doesn't automatically work in another. Urban apartment blocks need different systems than rural villages. Neighborhoods with many elderly residents need different solutions than ones with young families. Communities with existing cultural institutions, churches, community centers, social clubs, can mobilize faster than fragmented neighborhoods. There's no one-size-fits-all community response, which means scaling these efforts requires nuance, not just throwing money at a generic template. Why should you care about this beyond the abstract idea of helping people? Because this reveals a massive gap in how we're preparing for climate change. Governments talk about disaster preparedness. They create emergency response plans. But most of those plans assume professional responders will be available, trained, and capable of reaching everyone. During major disasters, that assumption breaks immediately. Phones jam, roads flood, hospitals overflow. In those moments, the only real protection most people have is their community. We're essentially relying on unpaid volunteers to do work we'd pay firefighters and paramedics thousands of dollars to do, and we're doing it without properly supporting them. The study also hints at something uncomfortable about inequality. Wealthy neighborhoods often have informal community networks that activate naturally during crises. They have educated residents who can navigate complex systems. They have resources. Poorer neighborhoods have just as much capacity and just as much need, but fewer resources and less access to training. If we leave climate response primarily to community volunteers, we're deepening existing inequalities. The people most vulnerable to weather extremes end up bearing the most responsibility for surviving them. This research sits in a weird space. It proves communities matter. It also proves we can't rely on them alone. It challenges the government-centric disaster response model without proposing we abandon it. It raises the question almost no one is asking. What does genuine partnership between communities and authorities actually look like? Not lip service, not consultation where decisions are already made, but real power sharing and resource distribution. Because the data here suggests that's where actual resilience lives. Here's the uncomfortable truth buried in this research. We could save more lives during climate disasters if we funded community action like we mean it. Training for community leaders. Coordinator positions that pay people for this crucial work. Liability coverage. Coordination with official systems instead of parallel systems. Integration into city planning and disaster preparation budgets. Not as charity, as essential infrastructure. We've known how to do this for years. We just haven't decided it's worth paying for. Until we do, we're asking the most vulnerable people to volunteer their way to survival. That's not resilience. That's abandonment wearing a mask. Turns out scientists have been busy, and they're not done yet.